All right. Well, first of all, happy Father's Day. and I know that today is Father's Day, and as it happens, today's reading from the Hebrew Scriptures has a father and son in it. And unfortunately, it isn't a great relationship, or even a good one. It is, in fact, violent. And I'm sensitive to the fact that although it is a story about a specific relationship in a specific place and time, it may resonate for some people in very personal, intrusive, and harmful ways. So, you need to know that up front. And please do what is necessary to care for yourself. Because some of what I have to say may be hard to hear. Now you're all worried. Well, don't be worried, Jesus says. Don't be afraid. Don't fear the storm. Have faith. My sermons always point to our God of love. And I've safely removed my mask to preach today so that you can see that love on my face, so that you can know my heart is open. Since the beginning of June, the beginning of Pride Month, I've been noticing the pushback communities and businesses have been getting for having Pride celebrations. And I have been reflecting a lot about the use of religion to justify our behavior as a result. I admit that when figuring out how we are going to live together in community, the issues can sometimes be very complicated. But sometimes they're really not. Sometimes it's very simple to discern, because as Presiding Bishop Curry has said, if it's not about love, it's not about God. And when we as Christians don't hold love as the standard for our behavior, people suffer. I remember, several years ago, the state legislature was considering some anti-bullying bills. Now, one would think that would have been a good thing, but unfortunately, there was some very disturbing language included in these bills. Basically, the bill said that bullying is wrong unless it is done for religious reasons. In other words, it's okay to bully if the kid is queer, or appears queer, or acts queer. It was an attempt to legalize violence against children with religious justification. Apparently, she says sarcastically, apparently it's in the Bible that sacrificing our children is an acceptable practice. Never mind that God put a clear end to that when God prevented Abraham from sacrificing his son, Isaac. The Bible is a very short read, the way some people engage with it. And in this case, just like the proposed legislation suggested, religion is killing our children. It was bad enough that our LGBTQ children were being separated from their families and scorned by society as a whole, but having the justification for that be God? Well, This particular legislative process made me realize that the clergy, the church, had to start owning our part in the condemnation, abuse, and indeed death of our kids, and start publicly repenting of the heresy that there is somehow some part of creation that the Creator doesn't love, and indeed has declared to be very good from the beginning. And thus, my public work to change the narrative began. And unfortunately, years later, there is still a lot of work to do. And I'm not looking to confirm that there were what has been called non-conventional people and relationships in biblical times. Because, spoilers, there were. And although that is perhaps interesting, it is not really relevant. What is relevant, what is actually life-saving, is affirming and celebrating the belovedness of LGBTQ children, youth, and adults right now by lifting up the biblical texts that illustrate the expansiveness of God's love through the many, many expressions of love between God's people. Because love, dear faithful, always, always makes more of us all. So I'm going to share with you a biblical love story today. It is a story that is told not in passing as a sentence or two in the Bible, or even a chapter. It is a story woven throughout not just one, but both books of Samuel. It is the story of the relationship between Jonathan and David, of which today we get a small piece. And I want us to be clear about the context of this relationship. It is told as part of the history of David's rise to kingship. And war is the setting, and military imagery is used. But there is another setting as well, the family. And telling the story through that lens breaks open the text and makes it more universal, more relatable, and more relevant. Saul is the first king, and everything that the prophet Samuel warned the people about when they begged to have a king like other nations is beginning to happen. They become a people at war with their neighbors and within themselves. And Jonathan is Saul's eldest son, heir apparent. And like many parent-child relationships, it has its contentious moments. And in this case, these moments were also violent. In chapter 14, there's an early example of Jonathan's defiance of his father. He got into trouble for tasting honey, for enjoying, as he says, God's abundance. Now, Jonathan wasn't there when the troops were told that they weren't allowed to eat before battle. He was off on a secret and very successful military mission. So he didn't know he was breaking a decree. But when he found out, his response was, "That's a dumb rule." And Saul, thinking he was doing the Lord's bidding, justified his anger at his son for religious reasons and refused to back down. He dragged his son, the warrior hero, before the priest and the people for judgment. And Jonathan was, in fact, condemned to death. But the people intervened. The people intervened, and Jonathan was allowed to live. And this, my sisters and brothers, is an example of how important it is to break the silence and speak up. The culture can change the narrative because God speaks through us too. Sadly, none of it really mattered to Saul. As we shall see, he was already primed for an evil spirit to take over him. In this morning's reading, father and son are together when David enters with the head of Goliath in hand. And it is love at first sight for Jonathan. Relatable, right? That's pretty much how my husband and I met. So, kidding aside, I don't have to understand how love works to recognize, honor, and benefit from its presence. And the language of love is used here, my sisters and brothers. Souls are bound together, covenants made, and items that had been held dear had been offered to the other person. Jonathan here sheds the very things that had previously identified him as a man, as a soldier, and in doing so redefines manhood to include becoming vulnerable. He sheds his armor. And as their story continues throughout the books, Jonathan and David will renew their vows or their commitment to each other and will continue to sustain one another. But the best part of their whole relationship, in my opinion, is that they were equals. Was theirs a marriage? We can't know for sure. But David and Jonathan can be an example of marriage. And honestly, I find the biblical examples, the traditional biblical examples of marriage between one man and one woman, or more commonly between one man and several women, to be sorely lacking in many ways. But that's another sermon, and I'm not quite done with this one. I want to bring this story back to the family setting, okay? Already jealous of David's military successes and worried that David was going to take the crown, when Saul discovers his son's relationship with David in chapter 20, he feels emasculated, both as a king and a father, and rages at his son, just like he does in David at today's reading, and throws a spear at him, trying to kill him. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 30, Saul yells at Jonathan, distances himself from him, and disowns him. Quoting verse 30, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Now that's Bible talk for being a son of something else. You son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Do I not know you have chosen the son of Jesse, this David, to your own shame. And there it is. There it is. The word of the day. Shame. It's a loaded word, and it's hurtful. And the LGBTQ community, our family, friends, and neighbors, have been forced to carry it around for way too long. Because the shame is really on the rest of us for not speaking up, especially the church, even as our children were being sacrificed. So here is my prophetic wisdom, dear faithful. And I'm going to say it twice, and then let us sit with it. For all of the things King David had to atone for in his life and in his reign as king, which were many, loving Jonathan was not one of them. For all of the things King David had to atone for, loving Jonathan was not one of them.